The Montana frost painted silver patterns across the farmhouse windows that November morning, and David Miller knew without looking outside that winter was announcing its arrival early this year. At 52, he'd learned to read the language of seasons the way other men read newspapers, and today the air carried a message that made him pause with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Something was different. Something was coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years of solitary mornings had taught David to appreciate the predictable rhythm of dawn on Pine Ridge Farm. The cattle would be stirring in the lower pasture, the chickens pecking at frost-covered ground, and the old barn cat would be positioning herself strategically near the milk pails. But this morning, as he stepped onto the wraparound porch that Sarah had insisted they build back when dreams of children and laughter had filled their plans, David felt the kind of stillness that preceded significant change. The 200 acres of Pine Ridge Farm stretched before him like a patchwork quilt, golden wheat stubble interrupted by dark furrows where he'd already begun preparing for next year's planting. The Rocky Mountain foothills rose beyond his property line, their peaks already dusted with snow that would soon descend to valley level. It was beautiful country, the kind of landscape that made a man feel small and grateful simultaneously. But lately, David had begun to question what purpose beauty served when there was no one to share it with. Sarah had been gone for 3 years, 2 months and 16 days. Not that David was counting anymore, he told himself, though his heart kept its own careful arithmetic of loss. The cancer had taken her slowly, giving them time to say everything that needed saying while simultaneously proving that no amount of time was ever enough. She'd made him promise to keep living, to find meaning beyond grief, but some promises proved harder to keep than others. The farm had become both sanctuary and prison in Sarah's absence. Every fence post held memories of conversations, every room echoed with phantom laughter, and every sunset reminded David of evenings spent planning a future that would never arrive. His neighbors in Millbrook Valley meant well with their casseroles and invitations. But David had discovered that loneliness was easier to bear when you stopped fighting it and simply learned to coexist with the silence. He was thinking about these things, standing in the crisp morning air with steam rising from his coffee mug, when movement near the front gate caught his attention. At first, David assumed it was one of Frank Wilson's cattle that had wandered through a break in the fence line. Frank's property bordered his to the north, and livestock had a talent for finding gaps that farmers swore they'd properly secured. But as David squinted against the early sunlight, he realized the shape was wrong for cattle, too small and stationary. Walking closer, David felt his pulse quicken with a combination of curiosity and concern. What he'd initially mistaken for a wayward animal was actually a large wicker basket, the kind Sarah used to take to the farmer's market when she sold her preserves and fresh flowers. But this basket sat just inside his gate, positioned as deliberately as a package left by the Postal Service, except no delivery truck had visited Pine Ridge Farm in the early morning hours. The basket appeared to be moving. David set down his coffee mug on the fence post and approached more cautiously, his mind racing through possibilities. A sick animal seeking shelter? Someone's laundry blown off a clothesline by the wind. But as he drew nearer, he heard something that stopped him cold. A sound so unexpected and profound that it seemed to echo across the empty landscape like a prayer answered before it was spoken. Children's voices. Whispered conversation punctuated by the occasional sniffle, the soft murmur of one small person comforting another. David's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the corner of the heavy quilt that covered the basket. What he found underneath would change everything he thought he knew about purpose, family, and the strange ways that life delivers second chances when you least expect them but need them most. 2 small boys, identical except for the way one protected the other with his thin arm, looked up at David with eyes the color of summer sky and faces that spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and the kind of premature wisdom that comes from experiencing too much hardship too early. They couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but their expressions held the wariness of much older souls who'd learned that adult attention wasn't always a blessing. The boy on the left, who seemed slightly larger despite their obvious twin status, spoke first with a voice barely above a whisper. "Are you going to hurt us, mister?" David felt something crack open in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since the day the doctor had explained that Sarah's latest test results offered no reason for hope. But this was different. This wasn't the breaking that came with loss, but the breaking that preceded growth, like ice cracking on a pond to allow spring water to flow freely again. "No," David said softly, lowering himself to his knees so he could meet the boys at eye level. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is David Miller, and this is my farm. You're safe here." The second boy, who had been silent until now, tugged on his brother's sleeve and whispered something that David couldn't hear. The first boy nodded and turned back to David with the solemnity of someone delivering important information. "I'm Tommy, and this is Billy. We've been traveling for a long time, and we're really hungry. Our mama said we should find good people who might help us, and we've been walking since the stars went away." David realized they'd been traveling all night, two small children navigating the darkness with nothing but hope and whatever instructions their mother had given them. The implications of their situation began to sink in, raising questions that demanded careful consideration. Where was their mother? Why were they alone? How had they ended up at his gate specifically? Or was it simply chance that brought them to his property rather than someone else's? "Tommy and Billy," David repeated, tasting the names and finding they felt natural on his tongue. "Those are good, strong names. How long has it been since you've eaten?" Billy whispered something to Tommy again, who translated with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to speaking for his more reserved twin. "Billy says it was yesterday morning when we had the last crackers Mama gave us. We found some berries along the road, but they were sour and made our stomachs hurt." David's heart clenched at the image of these two small boys foraging for wild berries, alone and vulnerable in country that could be dangerous even for experienced adults. Montana wilderness didn't forgive mistakes, and children traveling without supervision faced risks that made David's protective instincts surge to life with surprising intensity. "Well, we can fix the hungry part right away," David said, standing and extending his hands to help the boys out of the basket. "I was just about to make breakfast, and it turns out I always cook too much food for one person. It's like I've been expecting company without knowing it." Tommy hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing trust against necessity, while Billy remained partially hidden behind his brother's shoulder. David recognized the careful calculation in Tommy's expression, the way he was trying to determine whether this strange man represented safety or a new kind of threat. It was heartbreaking to see such caution in someone so young, evidence of experiences that no child should have to navigate. "If you don't want to come inside right away, that's okay too," David added, sensing their uncertainty. "I could bring some food out here if that would make you more comfortable. Whatever helps. You feel safest." The offer seemed to ease Tommy's visible tension, and David watched the boy's shoulders relax slightly. It was a small thing, but David had spent enough time with skittish horses and injured wildlife to understand that trust was built in increments, earned through consistent gentleness rather than grand gestures. "Could we maybe sit on your porch?" Tommy asked. "Billy likes to be able to see all around us when we're in new places." David nodded, understanding instinctively that Billy's preference for visibility probably stemmed from experiences that had taught him to watch for approaching danger. The porch would provide shelter while maintaining the open sight lines that helped Billy feel secure. "The porch sounds perfect," David agreed. "I've got some chairs out there, and the morning sun makes it nice and warm. You can tell me more about "Your travels while I fix us something to eat." As David helped the boys from their wicker basket refuge, he noticed details that raised more questions than they answered. Both children were clean, despite their obvious exhaustion, suggesting they'd been cared for recently. Their clothes were worn but had been mended with careful stitches, evidence of someone who took pride in their appearance, even under difficult circumstances. Most significantly, they each wore identical silver chains around their necks, small pendants catching the morning light in a way that suggested real metal rather than costume jewelry. The boys settled onto the porch swing that Sarah had loved, Tommy keeping one protective arm around Billy, while both of them surveyed the landscape with the systematic attention of people accustomed to assessing their environment for potential threats or opportunities. David excused himself to prepare breakfast, but he left the front door open so the boys wouldn't feel abandoned, and so he could continue talking with them while he worked. From the kitchen, David called out questions, designed to help the boys relax while gathering information about their situation. He learned that they'd been traveling for 3 days, sleeping under bridges and in abandoned buildings, following roads that their mother had traced on a hand-drawn map. They'd started their journey from somewhere called Riverside, though neither boys seemed certain about distances or directions, beyond their mother's careful instructions to keep walking north until they found good farming people. As David prepared eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits, he found himself moving with more purpose than he'd felt in months. The simple act of cooking for others awakened something in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death, a sense of usefulness that went beyond maintaining property or completing chores. These boys needed care, and David discovered he had reserves of nurturing instinct he'd forgotten existed. "Mr. David?" Tommy's voice carried from the porch with a question that made David pause in his cooking. "Yes, Tommy? Do you live here? All by yourself?" Billy noticed there's 2 rocking chairs, but only one person. David felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever someone noticed the evidence of Sarah's absence, the small details that revealed a life organized around partnership, but currently occupied by only one person. He'd grown accustomed to deflecting such observations from adult neighbors, but children's questions demanded more honest answers. "I used to live here with my wife, Sarah," David explained, his voice carrying across the distance between kitchen and porch. "She died a few years ago, so now it's just me and the animals. Sometimes it gets pretty quiet around here." "We're sorry your wife died," Tommy said with the matter-of-fact sympathy that children often express better than adults. "Our mama says dying isn't anyone's fault, it just happens sometimes, and the people who are left behind have to figure out how to keep going." The wisdom in Tommy's words struck David with unexpected force. Here was a child who'd obviously experienced significant loss himself, offering comfort to an adult with the kind of emotional intelligence that spoke of premature maturity born from hardship. David found himself blinking back tears as he arranged food on plates, moved by the generosity of spirit these boys displayed, despite their own obvious struggles. When David carried the breakfast tray to the porch, he was struck by the picture the boys made sitting together on Sarah's swing. They'd positioned themselves so each could watch a different approach to the house, their synchronized vigilance. Speaking of practiced survival strategies. But when they saw the food, their careful composure cracked slightly, revealing the hunger they'd been trying to hide behind polite conversation. "This looks like Thanksgiving dinner," Billy whispered to Tommy, speaking directly for the first time since David had discovered them. "Billy doesn't talk to strangers very much," Tommy explained. Though his attention was clearly focused on the plate of eggs and bacon David set before them. "He says there are too many people who pretend to be nice but aren't really." David settled into the rocking chair that had been Sarah's favorite, watching the boys eat with the focused intensity of people who couldn't be certain when their next meal might arrive. Their table manners were surprisingly good, evidence of someone who'd taught them proper behavior even under difficult circumstances. But they ate quickly enough to suggest genuine hunger rather than mere appetite. Billy's probably smart to be careful about strangers, David observed. There are definitely people in the world who aren't as trustworthy as they should be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But I hope that once you get to know me better, I won't feel like a stranger anymore. Tommy paused in his eating to consider David's words, while Billy continued working on his breakfast but glanced up occasionally to study their host's face. David had the sense he was being evaluated according to criteria these boys had developed through experience, tested against standards that had probably been shaped by encounters with adults who'd proven unreliable or threatening. "Mr. David, can I ask you something?" Tommy said when he'd finished his second helping of eggs. "You can ask me anything you want, Tommy. Do you know anything about taking care of kids? Because Billy and me, we're pretty good at taking care of ourselves. But sometimes it's nice when grown-ups know how to help without making everything worse." The question revealed layers of meaning that made David's heart ache. These boys had obviously encountered adults who'd made their situation more difficult rather than providing the support children should expect from the grown-up world. Their self-reliance was admirable but tragic, evidence of circumstances that had forced them to develop independence before they were emotionally ready for such responsibility. "I don't have children of my own," David admitted, "but I've always been good with young animals, and I think kids and animals have some things in common. They both need patience, consistency, and people who listen more than they talk. They both respond better to kindness than force, and they both deserve to feel safe." Tommy nodded approvingly at David's assessment, while Billy whispered something that made Tommy smile for the first time since they'd met. "Billy says you sound like you understand the important stuff," Tommy translated. "He wants to know if you have any baby animals on your farm." David chuckled, remembering the barn cat, who'd recently delivered a litter of kittens in the hayloft. "As a matter of fact, we have some new kittens who are probably about ready for visitors. Would you like to meet them after breakfast?" The transformation in both boys was immediate and remarkable. For the first time, they looked like the children they actually were rather than the miniature adults their circumstances had forced them to become. Billy even spoke directly to David, his voice soft but clear. "We love animals. Mama always said animals are honest about whether they like you or not, so you can trust their judgment about people." As David led the boys toward the barn to meet the kittens, he found himself thinking about the woman who'd raised them with such obvious care, despite whatever difficulties had ultimately forced her to send them traveling alone. The boys' courtesy, their protective bond with each other, their emotional intelligence and practical wisdom all spoke of someone who'd invested significant effort in their upbringing, even under challenging circumstances. The barn was David's favorite place on the property, a cathedral of weathered wood and golden light where the familiar sounds of animals created a symphony of contentment. The boys stepped inside with wonder, clearly enchanted by the horses in their stalls, the chickens roosting in the rafters, and the general atmosphere of purposeful activity that characterizes a well-managed farm. The mother cat, a tortoiseshell named Patches, had made her nest in a corner where old blankets created a cozy nursery for her offspring. 4 tiny kittens tumbled over each other in the kind of playful chaos that makes even serious adults smile. And the boys were immediately captivated. "Can we pet them?" Tommy asked, already kneeling beside the nest with Billy close behind him. "Patches is pretty friendly, so I think she'll let you," David said, settling cross-legged on the barn floor. "Nearby. Just move slowly at first so she can decide whether she trusts you." What followed was a lesson in the universal language of gentleness. Both boys seemed to understand instinctively how to approach the mother cat with respect, offering their hands for inspection before attempting to touch her babies. Patches, perhaps sensing their genuine kindness, allowed them to carefully pet the kittens while she supervised with the watchful attention of a protective parent. Billy, who'd been mostly silent throughout the morning, began talking to the kittens in a soft voice that revealed his gentle nature. Tommy, meanwhile, asked David thoughtful questions about caring for baby animals, demonstrating the kind of curiosity that suggested a mind eager to learn and grow when given proper encouragement. As David watched the boys interact with the animals, he felt something shifting inside himself, a sense of possibility that had been absent since Sarah's death. These children needed stability, safety, and the kind of patient care that helped damaged spirits heal. David had land, resources, experience with nurturing vulnerable creatures, and most importantly, time that had been empty of meaningful purpose since he'd lost his wife. The morning was advancing toward noon when David finally broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind since he'd first found the boys in their basket refuge. "Tommy, Billy," he said, settling onto a hay bale where he could speak with them at eye level, "I need to ask you some questions about your situation, not because I want to pry, but because I want to make sure you're safe and that any decisions we make are the right ones for everyone involved." Both boys grew more serious, though. They continued stroking the kittens with gentle hands. Tommy, as usual, took the role of spokesman. "We knew someone would ask eventually," Tommy said. "Mama told us people would have questions, and we should tell the truth to anyone who seemed like good people. Can you tell me about your mama? Is she safe somewhere, or is she in some kind of trouble that made her feel like she had to send you away?" Tommy's expression grew sad, and Billy moved closer to his brother's side in a gesture of comfort that spoke of long practice, consoling each other through difficult moments. "Mama got sick," Tommy began slowly. "Not the kind of sick where medicine makes you better, but the kind where doctors shake their heads and talk in whispers. She tried really hard to find family who could take care of us, but our grandparents are dead, and she didn't have brothers or sisters." David felt his heart breaking for the unknown woman who'd faced every parent's worst nightmare, knowing she was dying while her children were still young enough to need protection and guidance. "She spent a long time making plans," Tommy continued. "Reading about different places, talking to people, trying to figure out where Billy and me might find good families who would love us, even though we weren't their real kids." "Why didn't she contact social services or adoption agencies?" David asked gently. "There are official ways to arrange care for children when parents can't provide it themselves." Tommy's expression darkened, and Billy whispered something that made Tommy nod grimly. "Mama said the official people might split us up, put us in different families because it's easier to find homes for one kid than two. She said Billy and me belong together, and anyone who tried to separate us didn't understand what family really means." David understood the mother's reasoning, even as he recognized the legal and practical complications her choice had created. The bond between these twins was obviously profound, forged by shared experience and mutual dependence that went far beyond typical sibling relationships. Separating them would cause psychological damage that might never fully heal. She also said, Tommy added quietly, that some of the official families aren't as good as they pretend to be, and kids can end up in worse situations than before. "Mama wanted us to find people who chose to help us because they really cared, not because someone paid them or forced them to." David recognized the tragic irony in the situation. A dying mother, desperate to protect her children, had made a choice that demonstrated profound love while creating circumstances that could be interpreted as child abandonment. Her sons were now vulnerable to being placed in exactly the kind of institutional care she'd been trying to avoid, unless someone was willing to navigate the complex legal and social challenges involved in providing them with a permanent home. "What happened to your mama?" David asked softly, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "She died last week," Billy said, speaking directly to David for the first time that morning. His voice was steady, but tears traced silver paths down his cheeks. "She waited until we understood all her instructions, and then she went to sleep and didn't wake up. David felt tears gathering in his own eyes as he imagined the courage it must have taken for their mother to orchestrate their escape from what she saw as an impossible situation, knowing she wouldn't live to see whether her gamble had succeeded. The people at the place where Mama was staying said they had to call officials to come get us, Tommy added. But Mama had hidden our basket and supplies where they couldn't find them. We waited until nighttime and then followed the map she drew for us. David marveled at the planning and determination their mother had shown, creating a detailed escape route that had successfully delivered her sons to what she'd hoped would be safety. But he also understood that their current situation was precarious in ways the boys probably didn't fully comprehend. "Tommy, Billy," David said carefully, "I want you to know that whatever happens next, I'm going to make sure you're taken care of. But there are going to be people asking questions about where you came from and where you belong. Are you prepared for that?" "Mama said there might be difficult conversations," Tommy replied. "She said we should tell the truth and trust that good people would understand why she made the choices she did." David nodded, already beginning to formulate the steps he'd need to take to transform their temporary refuge into something more permanent and legally secure. It wouldn't be simple, but looking at these two remarkable boys who'd shown such courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable loss, David felt more motivated than he had since Sarah's death. "For now," David said, standing and brushing hay from his clothes, "let's focus on getting you settled and making sure you feel safe and welcome here. Everything else we'll figure out one step at a time." As they walked back toward the house, David found himself thinking about purpose and the mysterious ways life presented opportunities for redemption and growth. 3 hours ago, he'd been a lonely widower going through the motions of existence without real direction or meaning. Now he was responsible for 2 children who needed everything he had to offer and more. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but for the first time since Sarah's death, David Miller felt truly alive. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge Farm as David helped Tommy and Billy settle into what had been Sarah's sewing room on the 2nd floor. The space felt right somehow, with its twin windows facing east toward the mountains, and enough room for 2 small beds that David had retrieved from the attic. These had been purchased years ago when he and Sarah had still held hope for children of their own. Furniture that had waited patiently in storage for a purpose that was finally being fulfilled in ways they'd never imagined. Tommy moved through the room with careful efficiency, testing the mattress firmness and checking the distance to the door with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating new sleeping arrangements for potential escape routes. Billy gravitated immediately toward the window seat, where afternoon light created a warm reading nook, surrounded by Sarah's collection of children's books that had never been opened by young hands. "This room feels safe," Billy announced, speaking more freely now that several hours had passed. His voice still carried caution, but David could hear growing trust beneath the careful words. "I like that we can see the whole yard from up here." David understood the strategic thinking behind Billy's observation. These boys had learned to prioritize visibility and exit options, survival skills that broke his heart even as he admired their practical intelligence. The fact that they felt secure enough to settle into an upstairs room marked significant progress from the morning's basket discovery. "Your mama did a good job teaching you to think about safety," David said, arranging clean towels on the dresser that Sarah had painted yellow during one of her optimistic decorating phases. "Smart kids who pay attention to their surroundings are kids who stay out of trouble." Tommy paused in his exploration of the closet space to study David's face with the intensity of someone reading important information. "Most grown-ups tell us we worry too much for kids our age. They say we should just trust that adults will take care of everything. Most grown-ups haven't walked 3 days through unfamiliar country with nothing but their own judgment to keep them safe," David replied. I think your mama raised you to be appropriately careful, and I respect that wisdom." The validation seemed to release some tension both boys had been carrying. David watched their shoulders relax slightly as they realized they wouldn't have to pretend to be different than they were or apologize for survival instincts that had served them well during their difficult journey. As the boys unpacked their few possessions from the wicker basket that had served as their transport, David noticed details that painted a clearer picture of their mother's careful planning. Each child carried a small canvas bag containing extra socks, a spare shirt, and personal items that spoke of thoughtful selection rather than hasty packing. Tommy's bag held a carved wooden horse that showed signs of frequent handling, while Billy's contained a collection of smooth river stones arranged in a small wooden box. More significantly, both boys wore those identical silver chains David had noticed earlier. When Tommy's pendant caught the light at the right angle, David could see it was actually a small locket containing what appeared to be a photograph, though he was too far away to make out details. "Those are beautiful necklaces," David observed, casually, hoping to learn more about their significance without seeming intrusive. Billy's hand moved instinctively to his pendant, fingers closing protectively around the silver surface. "Mama gave them to us before she got too sick to remember things clearly. She said they would help us remember her face, and that we belong together no matter what happens." Tommy nodded, his own hand moving to mirror his brother's protective gesture. "The pictures inside are from when Mama was healthy and happy. She said if we ever felt scared or lonely, we should look at her smile and remember that love doesn't disappear just because people do." David felt tears prick his eyes at the profound wisdom contained in their mother's final gift. She'd found a way to give her son something more valuable than money or possessions, a tangible reminder of connection that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. "Your mama sounds like she was a very special woman," David said softly. "I'm sorry you lost her, but I'm grateful she raised you to be such remarkable young men." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle pulling into the gravel driveway that led to the main house. David moved to the window, recognizing the familiar pickup truck that belonged to his neighbor Frank Wilson. Frank's visit wasn't unusual in itself, but the timing suggested word about the boys' presence had already begun circulating through the close-knit farming community. "I need to go talk to my neighbor," David explained to the boys. "Frank's a good man, someone I've known for over 20 years. He's probably heard that I have visitors and wants to make sure everything's all right." Tommy and Billy both moved to the window, their practiced vigilance returning as they assessed this new arrival. David could see them cataloging details about Frank's appearance, his vehicle, and his manner of approach with the systematic attention of people accustomed to gathering intelligence about potential threats. "Should we hide?" Tommy asked quietly. "No," David said firmly. "You're not doing anything wrong by being here, and I'm not doing anything wrong by helping you. Frank's going to learn about your situation eventually anyway, and it's better if we control how that conversation happens." David's assessment proved accurate as he met Frank Wilson on the front porch. Frank was a weathered man in his 60s whose family had farmed the adjacent property for 3 generations. His lined face reflected decades of sun and wind, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence that came from surviving economic fluctuations, weather disasters, and the 1,000 challenges that defined agricultural life in Montana. "David," Frank said without preamble, "Martha Rodriguez mentioned she saw smoke coming from your chimney earlier than usual this morning, and there's been talk in town about a couple of young boys asking directions to farms north of Millbrook." David appreciated Frank's direct approach to the situation. Rural communities survived on shared information and mutual support, but they also understood the importance of discretion when circumstances required careful handling. "The boys are upstairs getting settled," David replied. "Their mother died recently, and they've been traveling alone trying to find someone who could take care of them. They showed up at my gate this morning in pretty rough condition." Frank's Expression grew more serious as he absorbed the implications of David's explanation. Traveling alone? How old are these kids? 8 years old, identical twins. They've been walking for 3 days with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever supplies their mother could put together before she passed. Jesus. Mary and Joseph, Frank breathed, his Catholic upbringing expressing itself through mild profanity that conveyed genuine shock. 8-year-olds wandering the countryside alone? What kind of circumstances would force a mother to make such a desperate choice? David summarized what he'd learned about the boys' situation, being careful to present their mother's decision as the act of a loving parent facing impossible alternatives rather than neglectful abandonment. Frank listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that complex problems rarely had simple solutions. "So what's your plan?" Frank asked when David finished his explanation. "Because you know as well as I do that 2 children can't just appear on your property without somebody official asking questions eventually." "I'm still working that out," David admitted. "For now they're safe, fed, and getting some stability after what's probably been the worst week of their lives. Tomorrow I'll start making phone calls to figure out the legal requirements for their situation." Frank nodded approvingly at David's measured approach. "Makes sense to get them settled before you start dealing with bureaucracy. Kids that age don't need the stress of official interviews and paperwork when they're still processing grief and trauma." The conversation was interrupted by movement at the front door, where Tommy and Billy appeared with the cautious curiosity of people who decided their host could be trusted, but weren't yet certain about his associates. Frank's reaction to seeing the boys was immediate and telling, his weathered features softening with the protective instinct that good men felt toward vulnerable children. "Well, hello there," Frank said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that acknowledged the boys' dignity despite their young age. "I'm Frank Wilson, David's neighbor from the next farm over. I heard you fellows have had quite an adventure getting here." Tommy stepped slightly forward, maintaining his role as spokesman while keeping Billy within reach of protective intervention if necessary. "Yes, sir. We're Tommy and Billy. We're sorry if we're causing problems for Mr. David with his neighbors." "Son, you're not causing problems for anybody," Frank said firmly. "In fact, I'm impressed by how polite and well-mannered you both are. Your mama did a fine job raising you, and any community would be lucky to have young men like you as part of it." David watched the boys' reaction to Frank's acceptance, noting how they seemed to stand a little straighter when treated with dignity rather than pity. Their mother had clearly taught them to value respect as much as kindness, understanding that charity delivered with condescension could damage self-worth even when material needs were met. "Mr. Wilson," Billy said, speaking directly to Frank with growing confidence, "do you have animals on your farm? We really like animals, and Mr. David showed us the new kittens in his barn. I've got cattle, horses, and more chickens than any reasonable man should have to deal with," Frank replied with a chuckle. "My wife keeps saying we should get rid of half the roosters, but I haven't figured out how to explain to them that their services are no longer required." The boys giggled at Frank's description of his rooster problem, and David felt a surge of gratitude toward his neighbor for understanding intuitively how to interact with children who'd experienced significant trauma. Frank was treating them as normal kids rather than objects of sympathy, allowing them to experience moments of ordinary childhood pleasure despite their extraordinary circumstances. "Frank," David said, "would you like to stay for dinner? I was planning to cook something special for the boys' first evening here, and it would be nice to have company." "I'd be honored," Frank replied, "but only if these young men don't mind having an old farmer cluttering up their dinner conversation." Tommy and Billy exchanged glances in the rapid communication style that twins often develop, reaching consensus without audible discussion. "We'd like that," Tommy said. "Mr. David told us about being good with animals, and we want to learn more about taking care of farm creatures." As the afternoon progressed toward evening, David found himself experiencing something he'd almost forgotten was possible: the simple pleasure of preparing a meal for people who would genuinely appreciate both the food and the company. He'd been cooking for one person for so long that he'd forgotten how satisfying it could be to plan a menu around others' preferences and to anticipate shared conversation around a properly set table. The boys proved eager helpers in the kitchen, demonstrating familiarity with basic cooking tasks that spoke of time spent learning from their mother. Tommy showed particular skill with measuring ingredients, while Billy revealed an unexpected talent for seasoning that suggested a sophisticated palate, despite his young age. Mama always said cooking was like science and art mixed together, Billy explained as he carefully adjusted the salt content in the mashed potatoes. You have to understand how things work, but you also have to trust your senses and your instincts. David was impressed by the philosophical depth of Billy's observation, recognizing wisdom that many adults never developed about the balance between technical knowledge and intuitive creativity. These boys had clearly benefited from a mother who took time to explain the deeper principles behind everyday activities rather than simply giving instructions without context. Frank returned from his own farm bearing fresh vegetables from his wife's garden and homemade bread that filled David's kitchen with yeast-scented warmth. He also brought news that would prove significant in the days ahead, though none of them realized it at the time. Interesting development in town today, Frank mentioned as he helped set the table with Sarah's good china, which David had retrieved from storage for the occasion. Martha Rodriguez said a stranger came into the general store asking questions about families in the area who might be housing children that don't belong to them. David felt a chill of apprehension, though he kept his expression neutral to avoid alarming the boys, who were absorbed in arranging dinner rolls in Sarah's wicker serving basket. What kind of stranger? Law enforcement? Didn't identify himself as official, according to Martha. Well-dressed man driving an expensive car, claiming to represent a family looking for missing relatives. Martha told him she didn't know anything about missing children, but he seemed specifically interested in farms north of town. The implications were troubling enough that David decided to address them directly rather than allowing uncertainty to create unnecessary anxiety. Tommy, Billy, I need to ask you something important. Is there anyone besides your mother who might be looking for you? Any family members or other adults who might think they have a claim to decide where you should live? Both boys grew visibly tense at the question, and David could see them struggling with whether to reveal information they'd been keeping private. Finally, Tommy spoke with the careful deliberation of someone sharing a dangerous secret. Mama said our father might try to find us after she died, not because he loves us, but because he doesn't want people to think he abandoned his children. Billy nodded grimly, adding details that painted a disturbing picture of their family dynamics. He left when we were babies because he said Mama trapped him with kids he never wanted. But Mama said he has a lot of money and cares about what other people think of him. David felt anger building in his chest at the description of a man who would abandon his infant sons, but return to claim them only when their mother's death made him look irresponsible. The boy's father sounded like exactly the kind of person who would use wealth and legal pressure to assert control without genuine concern for his children's welfare. Did your mama leave any kind of legal document expressing her wishes about your care? David asked, though he suspected the answer would be complicated. She wrote us a letter, Tommy said, but she said it might not be enough to stop him if he really wanted to cause trouble. She hoped we could find good people who would fight for us because they cared about what happened to us. The weight of responsibility inherent in the boy's mother's desperate gamble settled heavily on David's shoulders. She'd entrusted her children's future to the kindness of strangers, hoping their obvious worth would inspire protection from people with no legal obligation to provide it. Frank, who'd been listening to this exchange with growing concern, voiced the practical questions that were troubling David as well. Do you boys know your father's name? Anything about his resources or connections that might help us understand what we're dealing with?" Tommy and Billy exchanged another of their silent communications before Tommy answered with obvious reluctance. "His name is Richard Stone. Mama said he owns businesses in different states and has lawyers who help him get what he wants, even when what he wants isn't fair." The name carried weight that Frank immediately recognized, his expression growing grimmer as he processed the implications. Richard Stone Construction? The company that's been buying up land throughout the region for development projects? "We don't know about his business," Billy said quietly. "But Mama said he's the kind of man who thinks money means he owns everything and everyone around him." David realized they were facing a more complex situation than he'd initially understood. If Richard Stone was indeed the regional business mogul Frank had identified, then the boy's father possessed exactly the kind of wealth and political connections that could overwhelm local resistance to his demands. However, David also understood that legal authority didn't automatically translate to moral rightness, and that children's welfare should be determined by their best interests, rather than their biological father's convenience or public image. "Concerns. Here's what we're going to do," David said, making decisions that would shape all their futures. "Tonight, we're going to have a good dinner and focus on making sure you boys feel welcome and safe. Tomorrow, I'm going to contact some people who understand family law and children's rights to find out exactly what options we have." "What if Mr. Stone comes here before you can talk to lawyers?" Tommy asked with the practical concern of someone who'd learned not to assume adult plans would unfold as intended. "Then we deal with that situation when it happens," David replied firmly. "But I want both of you to understand something important. I'm not going to let anyone take you somewhere you don't want to go without a fight. Your mama entrusted you to my care, and I take that responsibility seriously." Frank nodded his agreement with David's position, adding his own commitment to supporting whatever course of action seemed best for the boy's welfare. "You've got neighbors who believe in doing right by children, regardless of what some expensive lawyer might say about technical custody requirements." As they gathered around the dinner table that evening, David felt the profound satisfaction that comes from sharing food prepared with care among people who genuinely appreciate both the meal and the company. The boys ate with obvious pleasure, their earlier tension easing as they absorbed the message that they were welcome participants in this gathering rather than charity cases being tolerated out of obligation. The conversation ranged across topics that revealed the depth of Tommy and Billy's intelligence and curiosity. They asked thoughtful questions about farming techniques, animal husbandry, and the seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural life. Their mother had clearly encouraged intellectual development alongside practical survival skills, creating young people capable of engaging meaningfully with adult conversations. Most importantly, David observed moments throughout the evening when both boys simply acted like the children they were, giggling at Frank's stories about stubborn livestock, marveling at the way candlelight reflected off Sarah's crystal glasses, and expressing wonder at the luxury of having seconds and thirds of everything on the table. As the evening wound down and Frank prepared to return to his own farm, he pulled David aside for a private conversation that addressed concerns neither man wanted to voice in front of the boys. "David, I want you to know that Helen and I support whatever you decide to do about these kids. They're good boys who deserve better than what they've been handed. And if Richard Stone thinks he can just show up and claim them like property, he's going to discover that rural communities have their own ideas about justice. I appreciate that, Frank, but I need to be realistic about what we're up against. Stone has resources that could make life very difficult for anyone who opposes his wishes." "Maybe," Frank acknowledged, "but he doesn't have what you have. He doesn't have two sons who clearly adore their caretaker, and he doesn't have a community full of people who understand the difference between biological connection and actual family." As David tucked the boys into their new beds that night, he felt the weight of decisions that would affect multiple lives for years to come. Tommy and Billy had found safety and care, but their future remained uncertain in ways that required careful navigation of legal, social, and emotional complexities. "Mr. David," Tommy said as David turned off the overhead light, leaving only the soft glow of a bedside lamp, "thank you for letting us stay here. This is the first time since Mama got really sick that Billy and I have felt like we might actually be okay." "You're going to be more than okay," David replied, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "You're going to be loved, protected, and given every opportunity to grow into the remarkable men your mother was raising you to become." As David made his way downstairs to his own bedroom, he found himself thinking about purpose and the mysterious ways life presents opportunities for redemption and growth when they're most needed. This morning he'd been a man going through the motions of existence without real direction. Tonight he was someone with a mission that felt more important than anything he'd undertaken since Sarah's illness. The challenge ahead would test everything he believed about justice, family, and the obligations that people with resources had toward those without power. But looking back at the peaceful scene upstairs, where two brave boys were finally sleeping safely after months of uncertainty, David Miller knew he'd found something worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The morning brought unexpected visitors to Pine Ridge Farm, arriving before David had finished his first cup of coffee. Through the kitchen window, he watched a black sedan with government plates pull into his driveway, followed closely by a silver luxury car that screamed wealth and influence. His stomach tightened as he recognized the calculated timing of this visit, designed to catch him unprepared and the boys still vulnerable from sleep. Tommy and Billy appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the sound of car doors slamming and unfamiliar voices. David could see the tension immediately return to their small bodies, the way they positioned themselves for quick retreat while maintaining visual contact with whatever threat was approaching their sanctuary. "Stay upstairs for now," David instructed. Quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd learned from years of managing unpredictable situations with livestock. "Let me find out what these people want before we decide how to handle this." The knock on his front door was professionally polite but insistent, the kind of sound that announced official business rather than neighborly social calls. David opened the door to find three adults arranged in a formation that clearly established hierarchy and purpose. The woman in front wore a crisp navy suit and carried a leather briefcase that marked her as some form of government representative. Behind her stood a man whose expensive clothing and manicured appearance suggested significant personal wealth, accompanied by another woman whose sharp business attire and calculating expression identified her as legal counsel. "Mr. Miller, I'm Grace Bennett from Montana Department of Family Services," the lead woman announced, displaying identification with practiced efficiency. "We've received reports about minor children residing on your property without proper legal arrangements. I need to speak with you about their welfare and current status." David recognized the careful language designed to establish official authority, while avoiding direct accusations of wrongdoing. Grace Bennett was clearly experienced in handling delicate situations involving children's custody, but her presence here meant someone with influence had activated governmental machinery to address the boys' situation. "Of course," David replied, stepping aside to allow the visitors' entry while mentally calculating how to protect Tommy and Billy from whatever legal maneuvering was about to unfold. "Though I should mention that the children in question are grieving recent loss and might need careful handling during any official interviews." The wealthy man stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having his presence immediately acknowledged and his wishes treated as priorities. "Mr. Miller, I'm Richard Stone, and those children are my sons. This situation has gone on long enough, and I'm here to take them home where they belong." David felt anger surge through him at Stone's possessive language, the way he referred to Tommy and Billy as objects to be collected, rather than human beings with their own feelings and preferences about their living arrangements. The man's entire demeanor radiated entitlement and impatience with obstacles to his desires. "Mr. Stone," David said carefully, "I understand you're their biological father, but these boys have been through significant trauma recently. Any decisions about their future need to prioritize their emotional well-being and adjustment needs." Stone's expression hardened at David's implied challenge to his parental authority, while the woman beside him stepped forward to provide legal reinforcement for her client's position. "Mr. Miller, I'm Patricia Morgan, representing Mr. Stone's interests in this matter," she announced with the crisp articulation of someone who viewed legal technicalities as weapons to be deployed strategically. "My client has every legal right to immediate custody of his minor children, and we're prepared to pursue all available remedies if there's any interference with that right." Grace Bennett intervened before the conversation could escalate into open confrontation. Her professional training, evident in the way she redirected focus toward the children's welfare rather than the adults' competing claims. "Perhaps we could speak with the boys themselves," she suggested diplomatically. "Department policy requires us to assess their current condition and gather their input about their living preferences, especially in cases involving potential custody disputes." David realized he had no legal grounds to refuse the request, but he also understood that Tommy and Billy needed preparation before facing official questioning that could determine their entire future. These children had already demonstrated remarkable resilience, but they were still 8-year-old boys processing grief and trauma while trying to navigate adult conflicts beyond their control. "The boys are upstairs," David acknowledged. "But I'd like to be present during any interviews to provide emotional support if they need it." "That won't be necessary," Patricia Morgan interjected sharply. "Mr. Stone is their father and legal guardian. Any support they require can be provided by family rather than strangers who have no legitimate role in their lives." The dismissive contempt in Morgan's voice sparked protective fury in David's chest, but he forced himself to respond with measured control rather than the anger he felt toward people who viewed children's emotions as inconvenient complications to legal proceedings. "With respect, Ms. Morgan, these boys have been living in my home and under my care. They've formed attachments and established routines that provide stability during a very difficult period in their lives. Disrupting those connections abruptly could cause additional psychological harm." Richard Stone's patience finally cracked, revealing the demanding personality that his wealth usually allowed him to exercise without resistance. "Mr. Miller, I don't know what game you think you're playing here, but these are my children, and I want them packed and ready to leave within the hour. I've already made arrangements for their enrollment in a proper boarding school where they'll receive appropriate education and supervision." The casual mention of boarding school sent chills through David as he realized Stone's true intentions. The man wasn't planning to provide personal care for his sons, but to warehouse them in an institutional setting where they'd be someone else's responsibility while he maintained legal control and public appearance of proper fatherhood. "Boarding school?" David couldn't keep the shock out of his voice. "Mr. Stone, these boys just lost their mother. They need stability, emotional support, and people who care about them as individuals, not institutional management by strangers." "What they need," Stone replied coldly, "is discipline, structure, and preparation for taking their place as members of a respectable family. Their mother filled their heads with sentimental nonsense, but I'll provide them with practical education that serves their long-term interests." The conversation was interrupted by movement on the staircase as Tommy and Billy appeared, drawn by voices they'd probably recognized despite David's instruction to remain upstairs. Both boys moved with the careful deliberation of people entering dangerous territory, their earlier relaxation replaced by the vigilant tension David had observed during their first hours on the farm. Richard Stone's reaction to seeing his sons revealed everything David needed to know about the man's capacity for genuine parental feeling. Instead of warmth, relief, or even basic pleasure at their reunion, Stone's expression showed only critical assessment of their appearance and behavior. "Thomas William," Stone said formally, using names that clearly weren't how the boys thought of themselves. "You've caused considerable trouble with this disappearing act. I hope you're prepared to apologize for the inconvenience and expense your behavior has created." David watched Tommy and Billy's faces close down at their father's cold reception, the way they instinctively moved closer together in response to criticism rather than comfort. These children had clearly never experienced unconditional love from this man, and his first words to them focused on inconvenience rather than concern for their welfare. "We're sorry, sir," Tommy replied with the mechanical politeness of someone who'd learned to minimize conflict through careful compliance. "We didn't mean to cause problems." "Nevertheless, you did cause problems," Stone continued, seemingly oblivious to the way his sons flinched at his harsh tone. "Running away was irresponsible and dangerous, and there will be consequences once we return home." Grace Bennett finally intervened, her professional instincts clearly troubled by the family dynamic she was observing. "Mr. Stone, perhaps we could speak privately before making any immediate arrangements. I'd like to better understand the circumstances that led to the boys' current situation." "The circumstances are simple," Stone replied impatiently. "Their mother died. They ran away instead of waiting for proper arrangements, and now they need to accept responsibility for their actions and adjust to appropriate supervision." Billy, who'd been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up with quiet courage that broke David's heart. "We didn't run away from Mama. We followed her instructions because she said you wouldn't want us, and we needed to find people who would love us." The innocent honesty of Billy's statement created a moment of stunned silence as the adults absorbed the implications of what he'd revealed. Their mother had specifically planned their escape because she believed their biological father would provide legal custody without emotional care. Richard Stone's face flushed with anger and embarrassment at having his parental inadequacy exposed in front of official witnesses. "Your mother filled your heads with lies because she was bitter about our divorce. You're too young to understand adult relationships or make decisions about your own welfare. They understand more than you give them credit for," David said, his protective instincts finally overriding diplomatic caution. "These boys have shown remarkable courage, intelligence, and emotional maturity throughout their ordeal. They know the difference between people who care about their happiness and people who view them as obligations." Patricia Morgan stepped forward to contain the escalating confrontation before it could undermine her client's legal position. "Mr. Miller, your emotional investment in this situation is understandable, but it doesn't change the legal realities. Mr. Stone is the boy's father and has absolute right to determine their living arrangements and educational needs. Legal rights aren't the same thing as what's best for children," David countered, surprised by his own boldness in challenging people with obvious power and resources. "These boys have a voice in their own lives, and that voice deserves to be heard and respected." Grace Bennett, who'd been observing the interactions with professional attention to family dynamics, finally asserted her official authority over the deteriorating situation. "I think it would be beneficial for everyone if we took some time to properly assess the children's current condition and gather all relevant information before making permanent custody decisions." "Ms. Bennett," Patricia Morgan said with barely concealed threat, "I hope you understand that any unnecessary delays in reuniting these children with their father could result in formal complaints about departmental interference with parental rights." "I understand the legal complexities," Bennett replied calmly, "but department policy requires thorough evaluation of children's welfare in cases involving potential trauma or disputed custody. I'll need to conduct individual interviews with both boys and compile a complete assessment before making recommendations." David felt a surge of hope at Grace Bennett's professional courage in resisting pressure from Stone's legal team. The social worker was clearly someone who took her responsibility to protect children seriously, even when that protection complicated the preferences of wealthy and influential people. "How long will this evaluation process take?" Stone demanded, his impatience evident in the way he checked his expensive watch as if the boy's emotional needs were inconvenient schedule disruptions. "Thorough assessment typically requires several days," Bennett replied. "I'll need to observe the children in their current environment, conduct separate interviews with all parties, and possibly consult with child psychologists, depending on what I discover about their recent experiences." "Several days?" Stone's voice rose with incredulous anger. "Ms. Bennett, these are my children, not subjects for some academic study. I have schools to contact, arrangements to finalize, and business obligations that can't be postponed indefinitely." David noted that Stone's concerns focused entirely on administrative convenience rather than his son's emotional preparation for major life changes. The man seemed genuinely surprised that anyone would prioritize children's psychological needs over his scheduling preferences. Tommy, who'd been listening to this adult conversation with the intense attention of someone whose entire future hung in the balance, finally found courage to address the social worker directly. "Ms. Bennett, if we tell you what we want, will that matter in your decision?" Grace Bennett knelt to Tommy's eye level, her professional demeanor softening as she focused on the child rather than the competing adults. "Your feelings and preferences will absolutely be part of my assessment, Tommy. Can you tell me how you've been feeling since you've been staying with Mr. Miller?" "Safe," Tommy replied immediately. "For the first time since Mama got sick, Billy and I have felt safe and wanted. Mr. David listens to us, includes us in decisions, and treats us like we matter as people." Billy nodded emphatically, adding his own perspective with growing confidence. "Mr. David doesn't get angry when we ask questions or need extra time to understand things. He makes us feel like our thoughts and feelings are important." David felt tears gathering in his eyes at the boy's simple but profound description of what they'd found in his care. They weren't describing luxury or entertainment, but basic human dignity and emotional safety that every child deserved but that had apparently been missing from their relationship with their biological father. Richard Stone's reaction to his son's testimony revealed the depth of his disconnection from their emotional reality. Instead of concern about their previous feelings of fear or appreciation for their current sense of security, he focused on correcting what he saw as their misguided preferences. "Boys, you're confused about what's best for your long-term development," Stone said with patronizing certainty. "Mr. Miller seems nice, but he can't provide you with the education, opportunities, and social connections you'll need to succeed in life. Boarding school will prepare you for university and eventual careers in the family business." "What if we don't want careers in your business?" Billy asked with quiet defiance that surprised everyone, including himself. "What if we want to be farmers or veterinarians or something else that makes us happy?" Stone's expression showed genuine shock at the idea that his sons might have personal ambitions independent of his plans for their futures. "You're 8 years old. You don't know what will make you happy in 20 years. My job as your father is to ensure you have maximum opportunities, not to indulge childish fantasies." David recognized the fundamental conflict that made resolution so difficult. Stone viewed fatherhood as management responsibility focused on producing successful adults, according to his definition of success. Tommy and Billy needed emotional nurturing that helped them develop their own identities and pursue their own dreams with confidence and support. Grace Bennett continued her informal assessment by observing how the boys interacted with both potential guardians. When she asked them to show her around their current living space, Tommy and Billy eagerly led her upstairs to their room, chattering excitedly about the kittens, their favorite books, and the plans David had discussed for building them a treehouse after the winter weather passed. Their enthusiasm stood in stark contrast to their careful, subdued behavior around their biological father, who seemed to inspire compliance rather than affection. David could see Bennett noting these differences in the way the boys' body language changed depending on which adult they were addressing. The evaluation process continued throughout the morning, with Bennett asking thoughtful questions designed to understand the boys' emotional state, their relationship with David, and their feelings about potential future arrangements. She also spent time interviewing David about his motivations for taking in the children and his plans for their long-term care. "Mr. Miller," Bennett said during their private conversation, "I can see that you've formed genuine attachments to these boys and that they've responded positively to your care. However, I need to understand your intentions regarding permanency. Are you prepared for the legal and financial responsibilities of formal guardianship or adoption?" David had been thinking about exactly these questions since the boys' arrival, recognizing that emotional commitment needed to be backed by practical planning and legal formalization. "Ms. Bennett, I want whatever arrangement provides Tommy and Billy with the most stability and happiness. If that means pursuing formal adoption, I'm prepared to do whatever's necessary to make that happen. That's a significant commitment," Bennett observed. Single-parent adoption involves extensive background checks, home studies, and ongoing supervision. Are you confident about taking on such responsibility? "I've never been more certain about anything in my life," David replied, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. These boys need someone who loves them unconditionally and supports their individual development. I can provide that kind of home. Meanwhile, Patricia Morgan was conducting her own strategic assessment of the situation, clearly frustrated by Grace Bennett's thorough evaluation process and looking for leverage to expedite her client's objectives. "Ms. Bennett," Morgan said during a break in the interviews, "I hope you're considering the broader implications of this situation. Mr. Miller is a single man with no experience raising children, while Mr. Stone can provide educational opportunities, financial security, and social advantages that a rural farm could never match. I'm considering what's in the best interests of the children," Bennett replied firmly. "That includes their emotional security, attachment relationships, and their own expressed preferences about their living situation. Children that age don't have the maturity to make life-altering decisions," Morgan countered. "That's why parents have legal authority to override children's preferences when necessary for their long-term welfare." David listened to this exchange with growing frustration at the way Morgan reduced Tommy and Billy to legal abstractions rather than recognizing them as human beings with valid feelings and needs. The boys had demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence throughout their ordeal, but Stone's legal team insisted on treating them as incapable of meaningful input about their own lives. The confrontation reached a turning point when Frank Wilson arrived unannounced, bringing with him information that would significantly alter the dynamics of the custody dispute. Frank had spent the morning making phone calls to contacts throughout the region, gathering intelligence about Richard Stone's business practices and personal reputation. "David," Frank said without preamble, "I think Ms. Bennett and these other folks need to know some things about Mr. Stone's background that might be relevant to his fitness as a guardian for those boys." Patricia Morgan immediately objected to Frank's obvious intention to share damaging information about her client. "Mr. Wilson, any allegations about Mr. Stone's character are irrelevant to his legal rights as the children's father." "Maybe," Frank replied calmly, "but I think people making decisions about kids' welfare should have complete information about everyone involved." Grace Bennett, intrigued by Frank's suggestion that there might be additional factors to consider, authorized him to share whatever information he'd gathered. Frank's revelations would prove more significant than anyone had anticipated. Richard Stone has been involved in 3 separate lawsuits in the past 5 years, involving contract disputes where he was accused of fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, Frank reported, reading from notes he'd compiled. 2 of those cases were settled out of court with sealed agreements, suggesting he paid significant money to avoid public trials. "Business disputes have nothing to do with parental capacity," Morgan protested, but her defensive tone suggested Frank's information was accurate and potentially damaging. Frank continued his recitation with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd done careful research. More relevant to this situation, Stone was also named in a civil suit filed by his ex-wife alleging emotional abuse and neglect of the children during their marriage. That case was also settled out of court, but court records show temporary restraining orders were issued limiting his contact with the boys. The revelation that Stone had a documented history of problematic behavior toward his sons created a stunned silence in David's living room. Grace Bennett's expression showed professional alarm at information that cast serious doubt on Stone's suitability as a custodial parent. Richard Stone's face flushed with rage at having his carefully concealed legal troubles exposed in front of people whose cooperation he needed. Those allegations were fabricated by a vindictive ex-wife trying to gain advantage in divorce proceedings. They were never proven in court. "Because you paid her to keep quiet," Frank replied bluntly. "Just like you've paid other people to keep quiet about your business practices and personal behavior." David felt a surge of gratitude toward Frank for his investigation and courage in confronting powerful people with uncomfortable truths. The neighbor's loyalty was providing exactly the kind of community support that could make the difference in protecting Tommy and Billy from a father who viewed them as possessions rather than beloved children. Grace Bennett's professional demeanor had shifted noticeably as she absorbed the implications of Frank's revelations. "Mr. Stone, these are serious allegations that require investigation before I can recommend placing children in your custody. They're lies and character assassination," Stone replied furiously, "and I'll hold everyone in this room personally responsible for any defamation of my reputation." "Truth isn't defamation," David said quietly, his own courage strengthened by Frank's example. "And children's safety is more important than anyone's reputation." The morning's confrontation had established battle lines that would determine Tommy and Billy's future, but it had also revealed that Richard Stone's wealth and legal resources weren't automatically decisive when confronted by people willing to fight for children's welfare. The real struggle was just beginning. The courthouse in Cedar Falls buzzed with unusual activity as word spread throughout the county about the custody hearing that would determine Tommy and Billy's future. Judge Robert Chun had scheduled emergency proceedings after Grace Bennett's preliminary report raised serious questions about Richard Stone's fitness as a guardian, despite his legal rights as the boy's biological father. David arrived early, his best suit pressed and his hands trembling slightly as he carried a folder containing character references from neighbors, medical records documenting the boy's improved health under his care, and photographs showing their integration into farm life over the past 2 weeks. Frank Wilson walked beside him, carrying his own folder of evidence about Stone's business practices and personal history. The boys themselves had spent the morning with Martha Rodriguez at the general store, shielded from the legal proceedings but close enough that David could check on them during breaks. Martha had volunteered to provide childcare during the hearing, understanding that witnessing adult arguments about their future would only add to Tommy and Billy's trauma. Richard Stone entered the courthouse flanked by Patricia, Morgan, and 2 additional attorneys, whose expensive suits announced the significant legal firepower he'd assembled to assert his parental rights. His confidence seemed unshaken by the previous day's revelations, suggesting he believed wealth and legal technicalities would ultimately prevail over emotional appeals and community support. Grace Bennett sat at a separate table with files documenting her investigation into both potential guardians. Her expression was professionally neutral, but David could see the tension in her shoulders that suggested she'd uncovered information that complicated what should have been a straightforward custody determination. Judge Chun called the proceedings to order with the grave demeanor appropriate for decisions affecting children's welfare. He was a man in his early 60s whose reputation for fairness and careful deliberation had earned respect throughout the judicial district. His opening remarks established the serious nature of the proceedings. This court convenes to determine the best interests of Thomas and William Stone, minor children currently residing with David Miller, pending resolution of custody questions raised by Montana Department of Family Services. While parental rights are fundamental and protected by law, those rights must be balanced against children's welfare when circumstances suggest potential harm. Patricia Morgan immediately stood to establish her client's legal position. Your Honor, Mr. Stone is the natural father of these children with clear constitutional rights to their custody and care. Any interference with those rights requires extraordinary justification that simply doesn't exist in this case. Ms. Morgan, this court will determine what justification exists based on evidence presented during these proceedings, Judge Shun replied firmly. I suggest you focus on demonstrating why your client's custody serves the children's best interests rather than simply asserting his legal rights. David's attorney, Lisa Thompson, had driven up from Billings after Frank Wilson's urgent phone call. She was a family law specialist who'd built her practice defending children's interests in complex custody disputes. Her opening statement established a different framework for evaluating the case. Your Honor, this proceeding isn't about abstract parental rights, but about two specific children who've experienced significant trauma and found healing in Mr. Miller's care. The evidence will show that Mr. Stone abandoned these boys as infants, ignored their welfare during their mother's final illness, and now seeks custody for reasons related to his public image rather than genuine concern for their happiness. The first witness was Grace Bennett, whose professional testimony carried significant weight in custody determinations. Bennett conducted a meticulous evaluation of both guardians, carefully documenting significant differences in their parenting styles. In my assessment, she testified, Mr. Miller showed sincere affection, patience, and attentiveness to each child's personality during interactions. She noted that the boys clearly trusted him, turning to him for comfort when upset and engaging openly in conversation. In contrast, Bennett described Richard Stone's interactions as distant and overly directive. Mr. Stone communicated with the children in a formal, authoritative manner rather than offering emotional support. He seemed uninterested in their feelings or preferences, instead focusing on correcting behaviors he considered unacceptable. During cross-examination, Patricia Morgan tried to challenge Bennett's conclusions by highlighting Stone's financial stability and David's inexperience as a parent. Wouldn't you agree, she asked, that Mr. Stone's ability to provide financial security, educational advantages, and social opportunities outweighs subjective interpretations of parenting style? Bennett firmly disagreed. No, I would not, she replied. Children need emotional stability and secure attachments for healthy development. Wealth cannot replace the nurturing support, especially crucial for children recovering from trauma and loss. Dr. Paul Jackson was the next witness, offering medical insight based on his examinations of the boys while they were in David's care. Initially, both Thomas and William displayed signs of long-term stress, malnutrition, and emotional shutdown common in children who've endured significant trauma, he testified. Since staying with Mr. Miller, they've made measurable progress. They've gained weight, show normal stress levels, and engage socially in age-appropriate ways. When Morgan suggested that this improvement might just be due to the passage of time, Dr. Jackson disagreed. In my medical opinion, he stated, the children's progress reflects emotional recovery linked directly to the quality of care Mr. Miller has provided. It's not just physical improvement, it's healing. Testimony from Frank Wilson dealt a heavier blow to Stone's case than Morgan expected. Citing carefully gathered documents, Wilson described Stone as someone who used money and legal tactics to avoid consequences, Mr. Stone has a history of prioritizing control and self-interest over others' well-being, Frank said. He referenced court documents and his ex-wife's sealed testimony alleging emotional abuse, which had resulted in restricted contact between Stone and his children. Though Morgan attempted to discredit Frank as an unqualified neighbor, his calm and methodical delivery undermined her attacks. "You're not a licensed investigator or legal expert, are you?" she pressed. "No, ma'am," he answered evenly. "I'm a farmer and neighbor who cares about these kids. But I know how to research public records and verify facts." The most impactful testimony came from the children themselves, given privately to Judge Sheen and later read into the official record. Tommy spoke with heartbreaking clarity. "Mr. David makes us feel like we matter. He listens to us, cares how we feel, and lets us help make decisions. With our dad, we always feel like we're doing something wrong, even when we try really hard." Billy added his voice with a simpler but equally powerful message. "Mr. David loves us like Mama did, just because we're us. Our dad treats us like we're problems to be fixed. We want to live with Mr. David because we feel safe and happy there." Both boys clearly stated their desire to stay with David and avoid returning to their father, citing specific examples of harsh treatment and fear of being sent to boarding school. In her final argument, Patricia Morgan emphasized the legal rights of biological parents, warning against what she portrayed as government overreach. "Your Honor, no matter how well-meaning Mr. Miller may be, he cannot override the constitutional rights of a parent who's broken no law and presents no proven danger," she argued. She pointed to Stone's financial means and future plans as evidence of his fitness, dismissing the children's preferences as emotional but legally insufficient. Lisa Thompson's closing focused on the boys' well-being and clear preferences. Backed by expert testimony, she emphasized the emotional and physical improvements the children had shown in David's care, arguing that their voices and needs should guide the court's decision. "Your Honor, these boys have survived abandonment, loss, and trauma to find healing and happiness in Mr. Miller's home. They've stated clearly that they feel safe, loved, and valued in his care." She emphasized that the law required consideration of children's best interests, not simply biological relationships or material advantages. "The evidence shows unequivocally that these children thrive under Mr. Miller's nurturing care and fear returning to their father's harsh control. Their welfare must take precedence over abstract legal principles." Judge Chun's deliberation lasted 3 hours, during which David paced the courthouse corridors while Frank provided steady reassurance and Martha Rodriguez brought updates about the boys' well-being at the general store. The waiting felt endless, with everyone understanding that the judge's decision would shape Tommy and Billy's entire future. When court reconvened, Judge Chun's expression was grave as he prepared to announce his ruling. The packed courtroom fell silent as community members who'd gathered to support David and the boys awaited the decision that would determine whether local values of compassion and child welfare could prevail over wealth and legal technicalities. This case presents a conflict between parental rights and children's welfare that requires careful balancing of competing interests, Judge Shen began. While the law recognizes the fundamental rights of natural parents, those rights are not absolute when children's safety and emotional well-being are at stake. He systematically reviewed the evidence presented by both sides, acknowledging Stone's legal standing while noting the concerning pattern of behavior documented in Frank Wilson's investigation and Grace Bennett's professional assessment. The testimony of Thomas and William themselves carries significant weight in this determination. These children have articulated clear preferences based on their direct experience with both potential guardians. Their stated fears about returning to their father's custody cannot be dismissed as mere childish whims. David felt his heart racing as Judge Chun approached his actual ruling, the words that would either validate the family they'd begun building together or tear apart the bonds of love and trust that had developed over the past 2 weeks. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, this court finds that the best interests of Thomas and William Stone are served by continued placement with David Miller, pending completion of formal adoption proceedings. The courtroom erupted in cheers from community members who'd attended to support David and the boys, while Richard Stone's face flushed with rage at the unexpected defeat. Patricia Morgan immediately began arguing for an appeal, but Judge Shen continued with specific conditions for his ruling. Mr. Miller will undergo the standard adoption home study process under Department of Family Services supervision. Mr. Stone will be granted supervised visitation rights, pending completion of parenting classes and anger management counseling recommended by the court's psychological evaluation. The judge's final words address the broader implications of his decision. This ruling reflects the court's determination that children's emotional security and demonstrated attachment relationships must be prioritized over biological connections, when those connections have been severed by abandonment and neglect. As the courtroom gradually emptied, David found himself surrounded by neighbors offering congratulations and support. Frank Wilson's emotional embrace conveyed years of friendship and shared commitment to protecting vulnerable community members. Martha Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes as she prepared to bring Tommy and Billy to hear the news that would secure their future. Patricia Morgan's furious consultation with Richard Stone suggested they would indeed pursue an appeal, but Judge Chun's thorough documentation of his reasoning would make overturning his decision difficult. More importantly, the boys would remain in David's care during any appeal process, allowing their sense of security and belonging to deepen. When Tommy and Billy arrived at the courthouse, their anxious faces immediately searched David's expression for clues about their fate. His smile and open arms told them everything they needed to know before he spoke, the words that would change all their lives forever. "You're staying home with me," David said as both boys rushed into his embrace. "We're going to be a real family, legally and officially and permanently." Tommy's tears of relief mixed with joy as he hugged David with 8-year-old intensity. "Really? We don't have to leave? We can stay at the farm and help with the animals and go to school in Millbrook?" "Really and truly," David confirmed. "Judge Chun decided that you belong with people who love you unconditionally, and that's exactly what you have with me." Billy's quiet voice carried profound satisfaction as he added his own perspective on their victory. "Mama said if we were brave and honest, good people would help us find where we belonged. She was right." The afternoon celebration at Pine Ridge Farm brought together the entire network of support that had made their victory possible. Martha Rodriguez arrived with a cake she'd baked during the court proceedings, while Frank and Helen Wilson brought their children to welcome Tommy and Billy officially into the extended family of Millbrook Valley. Dr. Jackson stopped by to check on the boys and offer his services for their continued medical care, while Grace Bennett scheduled follow-up visits to monitor their adjustment and begin the formal adoption paperwork that would make their family relationship legally permanent. Even Lisa Thompson stayed for dinner, charmed by the boys' eager questions about legal procedures and the obvious excitement about understanding the official processes that had secured their future. Her professional satisfaction at winning a difficult case was enhanced by witnessing the genuine happiness her victory had created. As evening approached and their guests gradually departed, David found himself alone with Tommy and Billy for the first time since the morning's courthouse drama. The boys had maintained brave facades during the public celebration, but now their underlying exhaustion and emotional processing began to show. "Are you really, truly sure you want us forever?" Tommy asked as they settled into their bedtime routine. "Not just until we get older or cause too much trouble." David knelt beside Tommy's bed, taking the boy's small hands in his own larger ones. "Tommy, I want you and Billy for as long as you want to stay with me. When you're teenagers and think I'm embarrassing when you're adults with your own families. When you're old men telling stories about your childhood on this farm, you're my sons now, in every way that matters. Billy's question came from a place of lingering fear, the same fear that had driven his mother to make the difficult decisions she did. What if our dad comes back with more lawyers and takes us when you're not paying attention? He asked, his voice quiet but anxious. David responded with calm reassurance. Then we'll face it together, he said. But Billy, Judge Chun's decision means your father can't just take you. He'd need to prove to a court that something major had changed, and we'll make sure that doesn't happen. Later that night, David lingered at the boys' bedroom doorway, watching them sleep peacefully in their matching beds. In just 2 weeks, their presence had transformed his once quiet home into something far more meaningful. Tommy and Billy were finally resting free of the uncertainty and fear that had followed them since their mother's illness. Though winning custody was an important milestone, David knew the real journey was only beginning, helping the boys navigate their grief, feel safe again, and believe their newfound security wasn't temporary. For the first time since their arrival, all 3 of them slept deeply comforted by the certainty that they now belonged to each other. The man who had once lived alone had become the father these boys desperately needed, and the boys had found the unconditional love their mother had given everything to secure. Outside, under the wide Montana sky, the stars shone over Pine Ridge Farm, a place where a new kind of family had quietly and courageously come into being. 6 months after that day in court, Pine Ridge Farm had blossomed into something David never thought possible. Each morning, the air was filled with laughter and birdsong as Tommy and Billy raced through their chores with energy and purpose, gathering eggs and feeding the chickens like seasoned farm kids. Just 3 weeks earlier, their adoption had been finalized. The small courtroom gathering included Frank Wilson as a witness and Martha Rodriguez, who cried tears of joy. With the stroke of a pen, Tommy and Billy officially became Tommy and Billy Miller, though in their hearts, they'd already made that transition long before. Watching the boys build a fort in the old apple tree, their voices full of focused debate and childlike excitement, David felt a deep and quiet sense of fulfillment. It wasn't about personal achievement, it was about the privilege of being loved and trusted by 2 young souls who had needed exactly what he had to give. That morning, an envelope in the mail caught David's attention. It came from Richard Stone's law firm, though Patricia Morgan's name was no longer on it. His pulse quickened. He had hoped that the legal battles were behind them. But when he opened the envelope, what he found was something entirely unexpected. The letter was handwritten, not typed, and its tone was somber and sincere. Mr. Miller, it began, I've decided not to pursue further custody challenges. My appeal has failed, and my attorneys advise me that continuing would be costly and ultimately unsuccessful. As David read on, Stone's words took on a tone of reflection. The court-ordered therapy has helped me see that my fight for custody was rooted more in pride and public image than real concern for the boys. Then came an admission David never imagined hearing. I wasn't a good father when I was in their lives, and there's little reason to believe I would be. Better now. It's clear they're thriving with you in ways they never did with me. Stone went on to explain his plan to contribute in a more appropriate way. I've arranged for educational trust funds for both boys to cover their college expenses. It seems the best way for me to support their future without interfering in the family you've built. The letter ended with a surprising request. Please tell the boys I hope they'll remember me as someone who, in the end, made the right decision, even if it took me too long to see what that was. David reread the letter before folding it carefully and placing it in the drawer where he kept things that mattered. Stone's surrender was more than the end of a custody battle. It was an acknowledgement that love, stability, and care had rightfully prevailed over money and biology. When Tommy and Billy returned from fort building, David explained the news gently. Your biological dad isn't going to try and change our family anymore. And he's setting up money to help with your college. Someday. Tommy responded with quiet practicality. Okay, but do we have to talk to him or anything? Only if you want to, David said. That's totally up to you. Billy, more reflective, gave a thoughtful response. I think Mama would be happy he's helping with school instead of trying to take us back. She used to say people should stick to what they're good at. He was never good at being a dad. Once again, David was struck by the insight and emotional depth of these boys. Their ability to recognize the difference between financial support and true parenting showed a maturity beyond their years, and one that came from their mother's wisdom. As spring melted into summer, life on the farm followed a steady rhythm that felt natural and earned. Tommy took to tinkering with machines, helping David repair tools and showing signs of a mechanical mind. Billy found his place with the animals, understanding their moods and needs with gentle intuition. At school, the boys thrived. Teachers praised their academics and noted their kindness to classmates, especially to those who seemed isolated or struggled. They were no longer just the new kids. They were part of the fabric of the community. Martha Rodriguez became a loving grandmother figure, teaching them to bake and sharing stories of the valley's history. Frank Wilson made sure they joined his grandkids for fishing trips and community picnics, helping them feel the joy of an extended family. Dr. Jackson's regular checkups confirmed what David saw every day. The boys were healthy, happy, and developing exactly as they should. And so day by day, amid small tasks and shared joys, the once lonely farmer and the two children who arrived in crisis now walked forward as a family formed not by chance, but by love, commitment, and the quiet courage to choose each other. The trauma they'd experienced was healing without leaving permanent scars, largely because they'd found safety and love quickly enough to prevent deeper psychological damage. Most importantly, Tommy and Billy had begun talking freely about their mother, sharing memories that helped David understand the woman whose desperate love had made their family possible. They spoke of her patience during their questions, her creativity in making ordinary days special, and her strength in facing terminal illness while ensuring her children's future security. Mama used to say that families aren't just about who shares your blood, but about who shares your heart. Tommy explained one evening as they sat on the porch watching fireflies begin their summer dance. She said the best families are the ones people choose because they want to take care of each other. Billy nodded, adding his own interpretation of their mother's wisdom. She told us that love makes people brave enough to do hard things for each other. Like how she planned our whole escape so we could find you, and how you fought in court so we could stay together. These conversations about their mother gradually evolved into a family project that would honor her memory while celebrating their new life together. David suggested they create a garden dedicated to her, planting flowers she would have loved while building a small memorial where they could sit and remember her during important moments. The garden project became a summer-long endeavor that involved the entire community. Martha Rodriguez contributed heirloom flower seeds that had been passed down through her family for generations. Frank Wilson helped design and build raised beds that would be manageable for the boys to maintain. Dr. Jackson donated medical herbs that could be used for minor injuries and illnesses, teaching the boys about plants' healing properties. Most significantly, Grace Bennett visited during the garden's construction, bringing an unexpected gift that completed the family's sense of closure and new beginning. She had located a small wooden box among their mother's possessions that had been overlooked during the boys' hasty departure from Colorado. Inside the box, Tommy and Billy found letters their mother had written to them for future birthdays, graduations, and other milestones she wouldn't live to witness. Each envelope was marked with specific occasions and ages, representing her determination to remain part of their lives even after death. The first letters, marked "For your first safe birthday in your new home," brought tears to everyone's eyes as the boys read their mother's words of love, pride, and hope for their future happiness. She had somehow found strength during her final illness to imagine celebrations she wouldn't attend, writing encouragement for challenges she wouldn't be there to help them face. "My dearest Tommy and Billy," the letters began, "if you are reading this, it means you found the good people I prayed would love you as much as I do. I am so proud of your courage in following the path I laid out for you, and I know that wherever you are now, you are exactly where you belong." The letters continued with specific advice about staying close to each other, working hard in school, being kind to people who needed help, and remembering that they carried the best parts of her love with them always. She had included small mementos with each letter, items that would have meaning for them at different stages of their development. Reading their mother's words in the garden they'd created in her memory, surrounded by the community that had embraced them as family. Tommy and Billy experienced healing that went beyond their own trauma to encompass their mother's sacrifice and love. They were able to celebrate her life while fully embracing their future with David. As summer turned toward autumn, David received a phone call that would expand their family's purpose in ways that honored both their journey and their mother's legacy. Grace Bennett contacted him about another emergency placement. Siblings who'd been found in circumstances remarkably similar to Tommy and Billy's situation. "David, I have a brother and sister, ages 6 and 9, whose grandmother died unexpectedly while serving as their guardian," Grace explained. "They have no other family, and they specifically asked if they could stay with the farmer who adopted the twin boys they heard about in the news." David's immediate inclination was to help, but he wanted to discuss the decision with Tommy and Billy, rather than making unilateral choices that would affect their family dynamics. That evening, he explained the situation and asked for their thoughts about expanding their household. Tommy's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "We should definitely help them, Dad. We know exactly how scared and alone they feel, and we know how good it feels to find people who want to take care of you." Billy's agreement came with practical considerations that showed his growing maturity. "They would need their own room, and we'd have to share your attention with more kids. But Mama always said helping other people was the most important thing we could do with our lives." The decision to accept emergency placement of Sarah and Michael Rodriguez, Martha's great-niece and nephew, felt like natural evolution of their family's purpose rather than dramatic expansion. The children arrived at Pine Ridge Farm with the same desperate hope that had characterized Tommy and Billy's appearance, but this time they found not just a kind stranger but experienced brothers who understood their fears and could guide them toward healing. Within weeks, Sarah and Michael had integrated into the Miller family routines with the resilience that children demonstrate when they finally find security after uncertainty. Tommy and Billy took pride in their roles as older brothers, sharing responsibilities for animal care and household chores while providing emotional support from their own experience of loss and recovery. The expanded family attracted attention from other communities dealing with similar situations, and David found himself consulting with social workers about innovative approaches to emergency child placement that prioritized emotional healing alongside legal requirements. Pine Ridge Farm was becoming an unofficial model for how rural communities could support vulnerable children through family-based care rather than institutional solutions. As winter approached, David stood once again on his front porch with morning coffee, watching 4 children race through farm chores with the joyful energy of young people who understood they were valued members of a loving family. The loneliness that had characterized his existence after Sarah's death had been replaced by purpose, laughter, and the daily rewards of nurturing young lives toward their full potential. Tommy and Billy had grown taller, stronger, and more confident in the months since their arrival, but they had retained the kindness, resilience, and mutual loyalty that had enabled their survival during their darkest days. They were becoming the remarkable men their mother had envisioned, raised with love but tempered by experience that would serve them well throughout their lives. The wooden basket that had delivered them to his gate now sat in the barn, repurposed as a nest for Patches and her latest litter of kittens. It served as daily reminder of how life could transform desperation into hope, loneliness into love, and chance encounters into permanent bonds that enriched everyone involved. David Miller had begun as a lonely farmer going through the motions of existence without real purpose or direction. He had become father to 4 children who needed everything he had to offer, husband to the memory of a wife whose values guided his daily choices, and cornerstone of a community that measured success by its care for the most vulnerable members. The abandoned twin boys who had been left in a basket had given their adoptive father the greatest gift imaginable, not just their love and trust, but the opportunity to discover that purpose comes not from what we achieve for ourselves, but from what we sacrifice to ensure others can thrive. In saving Tommy and Billy, David Miller had saved himself, transforming a house into a home and mere existence into a life of profound meaning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.